Well, this week marks 5 years since Britain formally left the European Union. Can it really have been 5 years,
Freedom
Kamal?
Day, Camilla.
Freedom.
Wonderful.
Do you know what?
I bet you were out there with your balloons.
I was there with red, white and blue bells on, I can tell you. Well, a lot has happened since June 2016. Shall we listen to a little montage, sort of encapsulating in 2 minutes everything that's happened since that momentous vote?
It looks as though the gap's going to be something like 52 to 48, so a 4-point lead for leaving the EU. And that's the result of this referendum, which has been preceded by weeks and months of argument and dispute and all the rest of it. The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
The dawn is breaking on an independent, United Kingdom. If the predictions now are right, this will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people. Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Mr. Speaker, I fear we are reaching the limits of this process in this House. This House has rejected no deal. It has rejected no Brexit. On Wednesday, it rejected all the variations of the deal on the table. And today, it has rejected approving the withdrawal agreement alone and continuing a process on the future. This government will continue to press the case for the orderly Brexit that the result of the referendum demands.
I am forming a new government, and on Monday, MPs will arrive at Westminster to form a new parliament. And yes, they will have an overwhelming mandate from this election to get Brexit done, and we will honour that mandate by January the 31st. Tonight, we are leaving the European Union. For many people, this is an astonishing moment of hope, a moment they thought would never come. And there are many, of course, who feel a sense of anxiety and loss. And then there's a third group, perhaps the biggest, who had started to worry that the whole political wrangle would never come to an end. I understand all those feelings, and our job as the government, my job, is to bring this country together now and take us forward. The most important thing to say tonight is that this is not an end, but a beginning.
Well, with thanks there to the BBC, ITV and Sky News. Before we bring Lord Frost into the conversation, who's sitting listening to that montage, like all of us, sort of slightly umming and ahhing, David, you negotiated Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, so you're central to the debate we're going to have about whether Brexit's been a success and whether it needs to be saved, which is in line with the Telegraph campaign we're running this week, 5 years on. Resident Stato Kamal Ahmed, can you hit us with some stats?
Yes.
Because we don't want Project Fear.
We don't.
And we don't want lies on the
home.
sides
Nope.
of buses. We want some clear facts
100%.
about public perceptions of Brexit in 2025, please.
I was just watching David Frost there as those politicians spoke and wondering how triggering it was for him.
I think it's triggering for all of
painfully
us.
in the bunker. But David, we'll get on to you in a second. But yes, recent YouGov poll, actually YouGov poll yesterday, said that only 11% of British people see Brexit as more of a success than a failure. 55% now say that the UK was wrong to vote to leave the EU. If you go right back to when the referendum actually happened, it was only actually at the referendum and a relatively short period after the referendum that Leave remained in the lead in polling. So that's been a gentle decline away from Brexit in the public's mind ever since 2016. And for this most recent poll, 56% of people in the UK would actually vote to rejoin the EU if given the choice. That's according to an average of recent polls. And then our very good friend, Piers Morgan,
our bestie,
who
yes.
we do love. He's been on
Well,
X
I don't know if I love him
today.
for this, I've got to be honest.
He's been on X today. He's tweeted. It's got a lot of retweets. What did he say?
It's now painfully obvious Brexit hasn't worked and is actively harming us economically. Brackets. It didn't even control our bloody borders! ! Given the British people would vote overwhelmingly to go back into the EU, We should have another referendum.
Please, not another one.
Not another one. So as we've discussed, we've got this wonderful Brexit series in the Telegraph. So it's called How to Save Brexit. We've heard from the likes of Vote Leave co-founder Douglas Carswell, the pollster Sir John Curtis, Brexit backing businessman Luke Johnson. I recommend you go onto the website, read those pieces. They're really insightful and honest and candid. And in that vein, Lord Frost, David Frost, joins us in the studio now. Lord Frost of Allenton. It's so formal, but should we just call you David?
Absolutely.
You're not going to
David's
say,
much
call me
better.
Dave in the spirit
No, I'm
of...
not.
You're not a Dave, you're a
I'm
David.
yeah.
And you were there, you were at the coalface of this, rescuing the Chequers deal and turning it into something more acceptable to Brexiteers under Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. We'll break the conversation down, I think, because we need to look at the economics of it, we need to look at the politics of it, we need to look at it in line with Trump now being the US president again. What's your feeling? When you heard that montage, what are you thinking, David?
Gosh, well, I mean, a bit of nostalgia, a bit of, I can't help feeling, a bit of the kind of anxiety that we all felt at the time and at the key moments of those negotiations. It comes rushing back because a huge amount was at stake. But nothing I hear makes me think, change my mind in any way that Brexit was the right thing to do and that the British people voted in the right way in 2016. And, not everything has turned out ideally in every respect. So I think everyone would say that, but that the world is like that. Politics is like that. The question is, have we set ourselves on the right path? And the answer is yes.
Should we lay our cards on the table? I voted for Brexit. David, you voted for Brexit.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where you are on Brexit, Big K.
I have never revealed how I voted. Now that we are not in the European Union, I cannot see a case for going back into the European Union. I spoke to people very close to Rachel Reeves over the weekend, and she was at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week. And I was briefed that business people, investors were all saying to Rachel Reeves, do not re-entangle yourself with the European Union, which was described by many investors at the World Economic Forum as a basket case. The problem with the European Union, I believe, is that it's almost impossible to get agreement between 27 sovereign states under a European umbrella when you've got people like Giorgia Meloni, Viktor Orban, what's happening in France where there's no real political leadership at the moment, corralling a sense of common purpose amongst 27 countries, I don't believe is practical. So I agree with you, David, that in the situation we are in now, it is important that we make the very best of the opportunities we have outside the European Union. But I would say Rachel Reeves, I think, is more sceptical. We'll get on to Keir Starmer later. I think that's a different type of conversation.
What is the economic reality? Because we do hear a lot bandied around. We heard a lot bandied around, frankly, during the referendum campaign. We all remember Project Fear. Economically, are we worse off because of Brexit?
Well, David can
Looking
kick
at
us
me.
off.
Yeah.
Look, let me just kick you off. Look, so the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, I think, is a trusted economic modelling academic organisation. The estimate is that at the margins, there has been a decrease in per capita income because of a more difficult trading relationship with the European Union. Now, my point has always been, and actually Luke Johnson argues this in the Telegraph in his piece, which, as you say, Camilla, you should go and read. He goes through the long list of things that would make the UK economy better. Hardly any of them are actually to do with the EU. So at the margin, I think there has been a small negative effect on our GDP by not being in the European Union. Many businesses have problems now with non-tariff borders. We've got the relationship between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, between Northern Ireland and Ireland. That confusion has caused some disruption, particularly for retailers, etc. Small businesses, medium-sized businesses wanting to export to the European Union have had to find new markets. That's not necessarily a problem. So I think there's a marginal negative effect, but I don't think that means, therefore, we should be trying to rejoin.
David, what do you think?
So I think the problems that we've got are quite in common with those of most other European countries. We're all suffering from high tax, high spend, over-regulation, the net zero problem, the consequences of high net migration and so on. The mix is kind of different, but all Europeans suffer from the same underlying difficulties compared to the rest of the world. So it's not obvious that rejoining in any way is going to deal with any of those underlying problems. We've all got to deal with those problems in our own way. And the important thing about Brexit, obviously, is it gives us A, new powers to do some things our own way, B, gets us out of some of the bad things the EU are doing, most obviously at the moment, their AI regulation, their sort of rather anti-free speech Digital Services Act and so on. We must remember that the EU itself has diverged quite a lot from where we were, as well as what we've done. Now, I agree with you, Kamal, about the difficulty of getting the 27 to agree on anything, and I think that is really now a big problem with the EU structure. Brussels powers go so deep, reach so far into what so many member states do that they can't move without getting Brussels permission and the agreement of lots and lots of other member states, and that just doesn't happen. In fact, in many ways, the EU structure is a recipe for kind of permanent argument and antagonism rather than friendly cooperation, and I think we can see that at the moment.
That's interesting, isn't it? I think we'd be in a different space now, wouldn't we, if the EU had really prospered since we'd left. It's almost like we're having a debate with the re-emergence of Donald Trump about which relationship to prioritise more, our relationship with the EU, which seems to be somewhat of a busted flush, and our relationship with the US, which seems to be somewhat on the rise. I appreciate it's very early days, and we don't know yet whether Trump's economic promises are going to turn into reality. So I think we're saying two different things here. I think we can have a consensus that we haven't made the best of Brexit, but I think the polling is indicating that the majority probably think that. I'm not sure the majority, if they really think of it really deeply, are agreeing with Morgan, because it's one thing to say we could have done a better job of Brexit, and quite another to say that we want to regress back into a situation where we are a member of the so-called federal states of Europe.
That's right. I think the polling is showing that quite a lot of things are going wrong in the country, and Brexit is getting some of the blame for those things. Now, definitely a lot of things are going wrong in the country and people are feeling unhappy. Our per capita GDP is actually falling. It's not surprising that people feel sort of fed up and gloomy. But what is happening, I think, is that the Remain campaign, which is much stronger amongst the political class than it is generally in the country, is attributing a lot of that to Brexit and saying Brexit is failing, Brexit's not working, is all the fault of it. And this is coming out in the polling. So I am sceptical that it's really testing opinion about national independence. It's testing the national mood. I saw a poll yesterday that said 52% of Brits were ready to leave the ECHR now, which hardly suggests, that people are kind of ready to go back into the embrace.
Maybe we should have had a referendum about that. That's the Michael Fallon, former Defence Secretary argument, by the way. We should never have voted to leave the EU. We should have voted to leave the ECHR. Do we think that COVID has done Brexiteers a massive favour in somewhat masking? Can we all agree, first of all, that the economy did not fall off a cliff after the Brexit? We were warned by Osborne and Cameron and others, the economy will fall off a cliff, we'll have mass closing of businesses, mass unemployment. That did not happen.
But I think that was because of actions that were taken, particularly by the Bank of England, to flood the market with new levels of quantitative easing, that there were positions taken that meant that Osborne's political threat was never really going to be true. I always felt, Camilla, I really want to get your sense of this. I always felt we needed to sort of bring in trading standards to this. Remain overdid the fear, and Leave overdid what would happen if we, with one bound, became free. In economics, I never believed either of those sides were true. They were marginal effects, which would be initially short-term a little negative if we left the European Union, but also we wouldn't have this huge rush of growth because we had left and with one leap we were free. Because as you say, David, the problems of the UK's economy are down to complicated taxes, too high taxes, net zero planning, regulations, workers' rights, etc., etc. But Camilla, how do you feel now, looking back to 2016, but also to when the deal was done? Do you feel disappointed that you felt there was going to be more of a boost to the country?
Yes, but then my disappointment is wrapped up with my disappointment over the Conservatives failing to keep promises that they made before Brexit, after Brexit, the Brexiteer Conservatives anyway, and in the last manifesto. So I was arguing for Brexit in terms of sovereignty person, because I did a law degree and we studied the law for all these years, and then we did this module at the end about EU law seemingly trumping everything, and it didn't make any sense to me from a legal perspective. And I felt that the EU appeared to be in decline. I felt that it was being, particularly in light of the Greek debt crisis and other issues, that there was an imbalance between North and South, that the French and the Germans were looking increasingly dysfunctional, and I didn't think it would serve our best interests economically or politically to remain in the bloc. I thought that what we needed to do post-Brexit was make ourselves more competitive, not against Frankfurt or Paris or Milan, but New York. And lo and behold, we're now in a situation where we are losing millionaires to America because they feel that deregulation, a lack of red tape, a different attitude towards workers' rights, scrapping DEI, getting federal employees to work in the office rather than at home, and all these things would help them to become more prosperous. So I'm disappointed that we ended up with Theresa May was not the person, clearly, to have negotiated Brexit. So Graham Brady was right to say that the sequencing of those prime ministers was wrong. We would have been better off with Boris Johnson from 2016 to 2019, and better off with Theresa May from 2019 and onwards, handling COVID. She'd have been better at COVID. He'd have been better at Brexit. Would have been better off with David Frost negotiating it from the beginning. He inherits a hospital pass. The Chequers deal was a aberration, frankly, and nothing that Brexiteers were promised. But it isn't Brexit's fault that we remain in this hugely frustrating, high regulation, high tax. I tell you what was emblematic of how the Tories squandered post-Brexit opportunities, and that was putting corporation tax up by 6%.
Totally.
I mean, David,
totally.
What on earth was that all about?
I mean, it was madness, and obviously, this is one of the reasons why I ended up leaving as a ministry. It wasn't the only one, but the direction of travel was wrong. I think two things. One, leaving the EU from the economic point of view, what everyone thinks about the merits, has exposed us in the sense that what happens to this country is much more obviously the product of our own choices. When we're in the EU, all we had to be was a bit better than most of the others, and that was kind of good enough.
And we had someone to blame, didn't we?
Yeah,
now we don't have anyone to blame now.
Now it's our choices that are putting the country in the position that it's in, and we have to be as good as the rest of the world now, and we obviously aren't. So that's one problem. It's exposed pre-existing weaknesses rather than creating them, made them more urgent to deal with. The other issue, I suppose, is you're right, Camilla. It is democracy and self-government that is the core here. One must remember that a country governing itself is the norm everywhere else in the rest of the world. Only in Europe is it an anomaly that you thought you want to run your own affairs. But you look around the world, and the successful countries are countries that run their own affairs successfully, and it's completely normal to do so. And generally, democracy, self-government produce the best outcomes for the country that have them, because they can run their own affairs, they can create consent by the people, they can tailor their economics to what they need. So it's natural they'll be more successful. And that's the bet that we're making with Brexit, that recreating our politics, rebuilding consent, getting us on a direction that suits Britain is going to be better in the medium term. And I think it will be.
Now, apologies, Camilla, we didn't get to your COVID point. What was your COVID point
well,
about?
My COVID point was, I think that, perhaps COVID masks some of the economic decline that Brexit may have sparked, but it wasn't necessarily Brexit's fault. It was a Conservative government not willing to fulfil the post-Brexit opportunities. So if you've still got a Conservative government sort of aligning itself with the EU when it comes to green levies and indeed bureaucracy and ridiculous rules and regulations that only serve to stifle businesses, then you're always going to have a problem. But what I'm saying is, I think it's very difficult to determine. You've looked up some figures there. It is quite determined to put a figure on the Brexit harm. Remainers like to say something about 100 billion. I don't know where they're getting that from. I think it's nonsense. We've had a degree of economic calamity and a degree of sclerotic growth in this country, let's be honest, for a decade.
It hasn't changed trend growth in the UK over the past 2 decades, leaving the European Union.
But I think that's down to politics.
Yeah.
I don't think it's down to Brexit.
No, I'm sorry. It hasn't changed trend
Yeah.
growth.
No.
Leaving the EU has certainly not changed the fundamentals of why the UK economy is failing. COVID, I think, and Ukraine were two sort of huge fire breaks in terms of our ability to even test whether leaving the EU was good or bad for the European Union. And of course, COVID then, after COVID passed and we unlocked, there was this sudden huge new wave of immigration into the country, which sort of, that seemed to me to be the moment. I remember I did a panorama on Brexit ahead of the referendum, and I travelled I'm from Ealing in West London, but my mother is from Rotherham in South Yorkshire. And Rotherham was one of the most highest Brexit voting constituency in the United Kingdom, and Ealing was one of the most Remain. So I met my old schoolmates in Ealing about why they all voted Remain, and then I went on a journey on the train up to Rotherham, and I met people who lived in Rotherham about why they wanted to leave. And the key, I remember speaking to a woman there, youngish, she was in her 30s, and her big thing, I think a lot of people did vote on sovereignty, a lot of people voted on economics possibly. Her big thing was immigration. And that is what she wanted to stop, because she connected immigration with the miserable economic situation in the town she lived in. And then suddenly, after COVID, we had this huge record numbers of immigration. And if that was the one offer to this woman in Rotherham, that offer failed. And I think that's been one of the biggest problems for the people who supported Brexit, was that the one big offer that people heard, the exact opposite happened.
What went wrong there, David?
So, I mean, it definitely did go wrong, and I certainly don't defend, what happened in those 2, 3, 4 years. If there is a defence, and I think it is a partial defence, it's that the economy had come close to having a heart attack during COVID. It had shrunk by a third at the worst point. Nobody really knew how it was going to come back to life again. Nobody really knew whether people would come back to the country, whether people would choose to leave. We did have, when we reopened up, these sort of supply chain issues, if you remember. People didn't know it was quite working. And I think there perhaps was a tendency in those N20 first half 21 decisions to sort of slightly err on the side of caution and say, look, we just don't know, let's just smooth it a bit and see how it turns out. And obviously that was calibrated wrong, but the mistake, I think, came later, and I'm afraid it came under the Sunak government mainly, to not realise what was going on, to take the view that the British people didn't really care that much about legal immigration. They only cared about small boats. Legal immigration wasn't an issue, and therefore we could safely let it balloon. And it's that ballooning in 22, 23, 24 that's turned out to be the problem. And we should have stopped that. It was completely in our power to stop that happening, and the government chose not to do it, and that was a huge failing.
Can you clear up this debate about whether Brexit has caused it to be easier for people to both arrive by small boat and to come here legally? Something about the Dublin Agreement. What's the truth of the matter? We've got less power over our borders now than we had because of Brexit, or is that not true?
So the Dublin Agreement is supposed to allow you to return asylum seekers within Europe to the last safe country. In fact, it had completely broken down, and had broken down for a few years before we even left. And in fact, we were, to the extent it was working at all, the numbers were very, very small. We were actually taking more back under the Dublin Agreement than we were returning elsewhere. So it was simply not working. And everything that's happened in the EU since we left about migration shows the system has basically completely broken down for them, and hence they've gone for these kind of quota sharing of asylum seekers rather than anything different. Brexit gives us complete control over our borders. There's no doubt about that. Complete legal control to say who comes here, under what terms, for as long or as short as we wish. The difficulty with small boats is an enforcement problem, that once people get across and into our seas and into the UK, they acquire these rights under the ECHR, under the Refugee Convention, under our domestic law. And while those rights exist, and they always will exist while we're under the ECHR, it won't be possible to deter people from coming. It will only be the sense that you don't get to stay and you'll go somewhere else if you're an illegal migrant that will deter people.
I remember the woman in Rotherham, and this is to the point of the ECHR, she wanted to stop all immigration. She meant everybody who comes to this country, not understanding that the EU was only one part of the immigration issue that the UK was facing. How much do you think, Camilla, what might be described as the Brexit disappointments, if they are as such, has led to the surge in support for reform? Because my argument would be it is much more likely to see Nigel Farage winning in 2029 a general election than the UK ever having another referendum to rejoin the EU. Do you think, because if you look at the recent polling on reform, they are now nudging towards Labour in the upper 20%, which is a remarkable achievement for a party that before the last general election did not have an MP.
So it can't be coincidence, can it, that surge in support for reform, and it is quite staggering, because I was speaking to Nigel Farage's right-hand man yesterday night, and he was saying he thinks they're on about 25% of vote share, considering they were only on 12 months ago, and they're a start-up party. And then you drill into the YouGov figures, and it suggests that 33% of people who voted Tory in last year's election are now opting for reform. But actually, when you look at Leave voters, 46% of Leavers are considering voting for reform. That could be because Farage is a very famous and prominent Brexiteer, but it could be because of concerns about immigration being tied in. So when you see Conservative, what are the two main complaints of Conservative voters that have switched to reform or just can't even bear to turn out to vote for the Tories? It is, you've broken your promises on tax, you promised low taxes, you promised not to put taxes up and they've gone up, and you've broken your promises repeatedly on immigration. We simply cannot trust you on immigration anymore. David Cameron talked about tens of thousands. The numbers have crept up and up and up under your watch, and we're now in a situation, which we discussed on Monday, I think it was, that we're now predicted to see our population rise to 72.5 million by 2032, and that's all made up by immigration. Actually, our own birth rate is tanking. So of course, that has fueled support for Nigel Farage, but because of the failures of both the progressive right and left, if we can call it that, that's how Morgan identified both parties over the course of the last 15 years. It's the vote for Farage is A, it can't get any worse than this, and B, to be fair to him, you're the only person we can really trust to bring these numbers down, because you've been consistent in your position from the beginning. Even if people think the idea of net zero migration is a fallacy, he is the only person that they can trust.
David, what's your feeling about, I'm not sure I know whether you have moved more towards Nigel Farage and reform, or you believe that Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives can still, have an approach to Europe, etc., which is something that you might agree with?
Well, I'm still a member of the Conservative Party. I still take the Conservative whip in the Lords. Obviously, I campaigned for Rob Jenrick during the election, the leadership campaign, rather than Kemi. I do think that if the Conservative Party is going to be successful, it needs to repudiate much of what was done in the last few years, not everything, but most things. It needs to be clear that it is going to become a properly Conservative Party in the future and set out a set of proper Conservative principles that might bring people in from reform. And it's got to do so with credibility, and that means that people, whether they're MPs, whoever in the Conservative Party, who aren't up for that programme, need to leave the party. And unless you do all those three things together, I think there isn't a hope of persuading people who've gone over to reform that, we can trust the Conservative Party next time. That might not be enough, because, the brand of the Conservative Party is shot to bits in the country, and the struggle it faces is a very serious one. But at the minimum, it's got to get serious about what it got wrong. It's got to show, not just say, but show it's different in the future if it's going to attract people back from reform. And at the moment, that's not happening. Now, there is still time, obviously, and I hope Kemi will set out some principles and do some of these things. But at the moment, reform have got the momentum because people can see, whatever their weaknesses, whatever you think about the individuals and so on, reform really want to do what they say they want to do. And from that point of view, they have a credibility that a lot of the Conservatives don't.
Also, if, as I suspect, Remainiac Keir Starmer does want us to... I think he's not going to have another referendum, we know that, but kind of re-enter or realign with the EU almost by stealth, then the party that benefits most from the fallout of that is Reform and not the Conservatives, because that will then alienate red wall voters who have been switching between blue and red in recent years to think to themselves that Starmer can't be trusted. They'll also reflect that the Tories can't be trusted because they gave them their vote in 2019 and it was squandered. And therefore you then get quite a lot of Labourite Brexiteers thinking the only person we can now trust is Nigel Farage.
I think the one person who agrees with that, two people who agree with that would be Pat McFadden in the cabinet, and also Rachel Reeves. I think that they believe there should be no flirtation with in any way rejoining the rule books of the EU. Keir Starmer, you're right, is a dyed-in-the-wool Europhile. He would actually instinctively love to be in the European Union. He led the campaign for the second referendum. But Rachel Reeves has made it clear constantly, and she's always been much more what I describe as Treasury skeptic. Treasury's always pretty sceptical about the EU. Gordon Brown blocked Tony Blair joining the single currency. Rachel Reeves comes from that wing of the party, and while she remains as Chancellor, and of course that depends on how the economy does, as we discussed yesterday, while she remains as Chancellor, she will be the block to Keir Starmer being able to do anything which she would believe would be a drag on, as you say, David, things like AI development, financial services development, relationships with the United States. David, what do you think the effect of Donald Trump is going to be? Because that's going to pull this government, whatever Keir Starmer's beliefs are, the politics have changed because he is the new erratic. The new president of the United States is the new erratic. Surely that means that the opportunities for us are to bend further away from the European Union.
Well, I think so. At the moment, if you're thinking in trade terms first, we've got a free trade agreement with the Europeans. We've got a big free trade deal with Asia, the CPTPP. We don't have a free trade deal with the Americans. America is the gap. America is where we should be looking to fill, and that's where the negotiating effort should go, from that point of view. I do think the effect of Trump will be, assuming he delivers and succeeds, he's going to show that governments can take control of the levers of government and actually accomplish things and make a difference. It remains to be proven, but it certainly looks as if he's going to have a good go at that. And in second, I think he's sort of destroying some of these shibboleths of international politics that have been very difficult to dissociate from. Most obviously net zero. he's just sort of wiped the net zero policy from the map in the US pretty well in the last couple of weeks. They already have energy costs much, much lower than us. I think that is really going to play into our politics. It's playing into European politics, actually, as well. We don't have to wait for the Europeans. We could have a different policy. We could start getting our energy prices down straight away. And by the way, if you want to find an explanation why our trade perhaps isn't as high as some people think it should be, it's high energy costs killing off big British export industries like oil and gas, chemicals, cement, those sorts of big energy, steel, high energy users that used to boost our trade, fallen off for the last 20 years, and high energy costs are a big part of that. So really got to get serious about a different course on net zero nowadays.
Maybe we should have a referendum on net zero, Kamal. Can you imagine?
We could have one big super referendum. ECHR, net zero, and should we get rid of Ed Miliband?